Effective legal analysis follows a strict algorithmic process of categorization, moving past the simple memorization of isolated case law. At the start of any dispute, you must define the origin of the conflict. Legal friction stems from either the text itself or the way that text is being applied. The first path deals with intrinsic ambiguity. This occurs when the legislation enacted by Parliament contains a structural drafting defect. The law itself is flawed as written. The second path isolates an extrinsic misapplication. Here, the statutory text is clear, but a statutory body or an individual is interpreting it with malicious bias or for private advantage. Conflating these two tracks breaks the logic of the entire claim. Applying a rule meant for a drafting defect to a clear law produces a remedy that has no basis in the legislation. Identifying the exact nature of the ambiguity is the mandatory triage step. You must categorize the problem before you apply a single legal test or maxim. This triage process drives the LDI decision matrix, a master logic tree dividing analysis into statutory, constitutional, and administrative pathways. First, define the petitioner's legal identity to determine active rights. Natural persons hold exclusive constitutional protections, such as freedom of expression and movement. Companies are not entirely excluded. Section 4B equality rights and general property rights apply to both natural and legal persons. The framework adapts its available remedies depending on the entity type. Misidentifying the petitioner type terminates the constitutional analysis. Because specific sections of the Constitution apply only to natural persons, the subsequent legal arguments lose their standing. Within the intrinsic ambiguity branch, the literal rule serves as the first mandatory step. Words must be given their natural and ordinary sense, unless there is real doubt. Judges have a constitutional duty to apply the clear text Parliament enacted. They cannot act as a second legislature to rewrite a law simply because the outcome appears harsh. The text only fails if it triggers the golden rule. This requires a specific threshold: an internal repugnancy, a manifest absurdity contrary to common sense, or a legal impossibility that prevents an offense from being committed. When triggered, the golden rule permits modification only to the extent required to avoid the absurdity. This ensures the provision remains valid rather than ineffectual. If textual modification fails, the analysis shifts to the purposive rule. Here, the focus moves directly from the text to the legislative intent behind it. Following Hayden's case, the court will identify the common law defect and interpret the statute to suppress the underlying mischief while advancing the remedy intended by the drafters. Statutory interpretation follows a strict sequential escalation. It moves from plain text to legislative intent rather than a random selection of linguistic canons. Every piece of statutory interpretation is bound by the supremacy of the Constitution. A law cannot survive if it breaches fundamental rights. In Trinidad and Tobago, constitutional review is governed by a rigid temporal fault line. The analysis depends on whether the law was enacted before or after 1976. For post-1976 legislation, Parliament faces a strict hurdle. To limit fundamental rights, the Act must contain a Section 13 express declaration stating its intent to operate inconsistently with the Constitution. Even with that express declaration, the law must survive the Achille-Charles proportionality test. The state has to prove the measure serves a sufficiently important objective, is rationally connected to it, is necessary, and strikes a fair balance. Pre-1976 laws operate under a paradox known as the Section 6 Savings Clause. This insulates older colonial-era statutes from being challenged, even if they violate modern constitutional rights. The Caribbean Court of Justice takes a dynamic approach to equivalent savings clauses in other jurisdictions, actively striking down ancient laws that offend modern human rights standards. Trinidad and Tobago retains the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council as its final appellate court. Bound by Sat Maraj, the JCPC will not strike out unconstitutional pre-1976 laws. TT courts can only read down the law to encourage less stringent enforcement for purposes of a modern society. In this framework, a law's date of enactment carries more weight than its consistency with contemporary rights. The final branch shifts away from the statute itself to extrinsic misinterpretation. Here, the language of the Act is clear, but its execution by a statutory body or individual is legally flawed. If a statutory body applies the law unequally, the petitioner must pass the combined test for a Section 4B equality breach. This requires proving the unequal treatment resulted from intentional, bad faith conduct. This claim relies on an absolute necessity. The petitioner must prove this unequal treatment by identifying a similarly situated comparator who received favorable application under materially similar circumstances. Conversely, an individual might try to exploit an unclear law for private advantage. Courts distinguish between lawful tax avoidance based on strict construction and malicious tax evasion. If an individual engages in an artificial series of transactions that possess no commercial purpose other than tax evasion, the court will disregard those procedural steps and suppress the evasion. This principle extends to penal statutes that are silent on mens rea. To promote public vigilance in areas like border security, courts will apply strict liability, displacing the standard presumption of innocence. In this extrinsic track, classical statutory presumptions do not act as absolute shields. The courts will override them when the public interest demands it. Pulling back from these specific branches, the full LDI analytical framework reveals how a single legal dispute cascades through multiple decision nodes. The operational algorithm is consistent. Verify the text for intrinsic defects, test the chronological constitutional thresholds, and audit the decision-maker's execution. When complex legal conflicts inevitably arise across these distinct branches, one final critical mechanism resolves them: the fair balance test. This metric forces the court to weigh the individual's vested rights, whether property, equality, or liberty, against the public interest intent of Parliament. Mastery of Trinidad and Tobago's legal framework relies on executing the correct procedural algorithm to balance private rights against public order.